Cyber Shadow was one of my most highly anticipated games ever, really. Since it was first announced back in March of 2019, I knew it was something I had to have. 2D, 8-bit, robots, ninjas, black and blue ninja protagonist, emotional soundtrack, freaking women, I don't know. First-time solo developer Arne Hunziker, otherwise known as Mecha Skull of Mechanical Head Studios, was approached by none other than Yacht Club Games to be his publisher. As with most modern retro throwbacks, the goal here was simple. Take us back to the 80s and 90s with a fast-paced, gritty adventure that would gradually test our skills as a ninja with a refined touch. Maybe race against a spirit monkey, I don't know, talk to a dragon or a bike. However, from day one there was confusion as to what kind of game this was going to be. Immediately, comparisons were being drawn to The Messenger, and you can't really fault anyone for that. On top of being another 8-bit ninja game, it had only been about 7 months since that came out, and was showing off a very similar movement style to the Cloud Step. So naturally, we were all like, yes! But of course, on the inside, we were more like, Ninja Gaiden was another common comparison for both of these games, actually, but I'll tell you right now, if you go into this expecting it to play like either of those, you will feel misled and possibly disappointed, maybe even Speckledorfed. This is not a funny, fourth wall breaking Metroidvania like The Messenger was. The funniest character is a freaking bike, nor is it a reaction-based enemy gauntlet like Ninja Gaiden. It's certainly closer to the latter than the former and has elements from both, but Cyber Shadow is such a melting pot of different games and ideas that you can't fully compare it to any one of them. If anything, it's more like Shadow of the Ninja for NES with trace amounts of Batman and Shatterhand. Then it becomes more Messenger-like halfway through. But that still doesn't paint the whole picture. Most of you are probably just thinking, what the heck is a Shatterhand? The story, however, is quite Ninja Gaiden-esque in its presentation, and I knew it was going to be a stronger focus based on the trailers, but unfortunately the narrative as a whole is being largely criticized for feeling inconsequential. Great concepts, you got a rival, love interest, old guy, this round gentleman, but not a whole lot of successful emotional investment, and I think the reason for that is a lack of screen time. While there is a lot of dialogue, characters aren't given nearly enough time to properly develop or showcase their personalities in full. Case in point, our main character, Shadow. Since he doesn't talk, well, except when he dies. Is that a gremlin? We have to rely on other characters speaking to him or purely through visual storytelling. And there is a great scene in the beginning where he falls to his knees and holds his hand out as a memory of his master fades away. But that's about all we get. We're told about this supposed bond that Shadow and the Master have, but we never get to see much of it. So those moments where you're so close to reaching her or another memory passes, you don't feel what they're feeling because you don't know what they've been through. It's like there are big chunks of story missing that were either cut out or just never got made. And according to an interview, that's kind of what happened. I can't believe I'm saying this about an anime-esque storyline, but I wish there were more flashbacks to give better context. More action scenes and establishing shots would have been great too. Like how every Ninja Gaiden game has that one part where you're looking at the big tower off in the distance and the music climbs to match the excitement. You see, kids, this. To be fair, there is a really cool opening cinematic. Shadow leaps into the broken city looking all cool, he slashes these robots in half and then has a stare down with a giant robot swordsman that we sadly never see in game, but this is a great scene.
Could I have directions to the nearest subway?
It's a fantastic display of who Shadow is and what the world around him is like. This is what we needed so much more of, even if only for spectacle. For a game that doesn't have the luxury of being 20 plus hours with fully voiced and animated cutscenes, I think brief sequences like this would have really spiced it up. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely cool stuff in here already, but as a casual viewer, it didn't quite hit the mark for me. I wasn't crying by the end like I probably should have been, even though the ending was pretty emotional. Granted, 8-bit storytelling doesn't have the highest bar, Undertale notwithstanding, but I can tell Arne wanted to share something unique, so if he wanted to patch in more cutscenes in the future, I would not be against that. One thing that everyone can agree on, thankfully, is the presentation. This is a delectably gritty game. Imagine if a tire looked delicious. You know what, never mind, that's kind of strange. The amount of detail that there is in a single screenshot of the various industrial settings is immaculate. Major colors like red, orange, green, blue, and violet blend so well together and pop right off the screen. Backgrounds have their own story to tell, like geothermal towers in its upside-down dystopian Zion city. Enemy sprites are beyond meticulous. You won't even notice it half the time. Like how the clips to these guns fly out as the robots reload them. That is impeccable detail. Shadow's running animation is so smooth I can taste the butter. The sound design is crunchy in all the right ways. Every hit you land is ear candy. And the soundtrack, we'll get to that later. This is a very traditional game at its core. You simply jump and slash your way to the end of 10 linear chapters and gradually gain abilities as you progress. There are some secrets off to the side with optional backtracking, but I must reiterate that this is not a Metroidvania. Right off the bat, I've gotta say, Shadow might just be the most fluid video game character I've ever had the pleasure of controlling. The top speed, jump arc, mid-air movement, it's all so tightly wound and yet light as a feather. It reminds me a lot of Alucard from Symphony of the Night. The only thing strange about him is actually his hitbox. Your head has no collision when standing still, so bullets can pass right through that tenacious cranium of yours, and it looks hilarious. I could watch this all day. This never becomes a hindrance of any kind. In fact, it's technically an advantage, but it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The other oddity, and maybe it's just me, is that I would often fall short of a jump thinking I had cleared a ledge. It looked like I was gonna make it, but only one of his tiny feet had actually crossed over. I then watched a friend of mine play and I noticed the same problem happening to him quite a lot. I'm not sure if this is an issue of collision or a misleading sprite, but as good as the controls are, this can get in the way unless you learn to always overcompensate your jump height. Not a big deal, but kinda strange. But the main quirk you'll notice, you can't duck. There's no crouching of any kind. This has perplexed many players, to say the least. I really don't know why such a basic function would be absent from a game whose sources of inspirations all have it. I refuse to believe that it was too hard to code in, so this had to be planned from the beginning. He just didn't think it would be necessary. And to be fair, it's not a big deal. Grounded enemies are always placed at sword's height, and projectiles can be jumped over. But for flying enemies who can come at me from multiple angles like below, having the ability to bring my sword's hitbox closer to theirs to match the elevation or duck under an incoming hazard is a very commonplace tool for this kind of genre. Yes, the game is perfectly playable without it. I'm certainly used to it by now, but why? What? Above all else, however, you will die. A lot. This is a tough game. Difficulty is a very popular conversation. It's nothing close to the hardest I've ever played, or even most of the games it's inspired by, but you will be tested on how many back-to-back enemy encounters and long stretches over spikes you can survive without much room for error. Precision is commonly asked, especially later on, with failure often resulting in death. It's like Operation, only I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad. There are no lives, so you're free to retry a given section as much as your robot heart desires, but checkpoints are moderately spread out to where skilled playing is still necessary to reach the next one. You know a game is gonna be hard when you die in the opening cutscene. Pretty light. Oh no! That being said, this is a remarkably fair game for how punishing it is. With the 2 or 3 exceptions where I fell on an enemy that I couldn't see because the camera wouldn't pan down far enough, every point of damage I took was my own fault. I always knew why I died, it was never in question. Enemies and bosses all clearly animate before their attacks go off and have recognizable patterns that are instantly learnable. Bosses in particular deserve a shout out. This is one of the most consistent series of fights I've seen in a game like this. Clear and memorable patterns, telegraphs on everything. Each boss has its own music. Certain fights require you to use an ability in a unique way, and the sound effects are so good that beyond winning, you're willing to make contact just to hear that. Special thanks to Optimus Prime for making an appearance, hands down my favorite. No, I didn't really mean. Mecha Dragon is somewhat of a sour spot for many because he spends most of his time off screen, and I agree that can be annoying, but it does mean you can do some cool tricks. Yeah, play games. The only criticism I have towards these fights is that they're actually too good. They're so telling of what they're gonna do that once you figure out how everything works, you can kind of annihilate them. Still satisfying getting to that point, but some more hectic patterns later on might have been a good idea to help raise the stakes. Now, while I do deem the game extremely fair, I must agree that there is some needless frustration. The best way to explain it is that every time I got hurt, while my own fault, it always felt like it was due to a silly mistake. It was almost never because of some clever trap that tripped me up. It was that one stray bullet that got me, or me being slightly out of position. Spikes, most of the time. I would never expect to die, even though I knew why I did. The method in which this game kills you is pretty simplistic. Enemy, shoot. You die! And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, as there are legitimately great interactions and combinations to be found, but there are times where it feels like you're being jerked around instead of challenged. Chapter 2 specifically, I believe, is the low point of the entire playthrough. Any negative reviews that complain about annoying flying enemies, getting knocked into spikes, or just feeling too slow are talking about Chapter 2. There's a lot of waiting for these garbage chutes to either pass or pile up, an auto-scrolling elevator sequence, watching these backpack guys slowly turn around.
Must have been my imagination.
It's not the most exciting stuff, and I think that causes a lot of people to lose their patience for when the frustration kicks in. These are rust flies, a common enemy found in here, as are their eggs. When broken, 2 or 3 tiny flies come out, homing in on your position. They can go through walls, arc around. The whole chapter is pretty boxed in, so there's not much room to maneuver. You can't duck for a better angle. There's like 50 of them, and you only have about 6 HP. This is a recipe for irritation. You end up doing this whole song and dance of running away to lure them, you move on, and there's more? It's not a terrible stage by any means. There are clever sections, but it's outweighed by this combination of repetitive enemy encounters and a disadvantageous shroud that covers the whole chapter. Even when you're good at it, it's pretty mundane. That's how you know there's a problem. Thankfully, that is the exception and not the rule. Every other chapter is pretty dang great. What isn't an exception, however, is the other method in which this game kills you. Yes! They went a little overboard with the spikes, in my opinion. Not in the amount, but rather how often you're thrust into them. Yeah, like that. And that goes for the whole game, not just Chapter 2. They're not all overflowing with them, but they all have at least that one part that will try your patience. See, it's my philosophy that instant death should be more of a scare tactic than an actual threat, especially in the early game. Make it a hazard that I have to avoid, but don't constantly shove it in my face. Look at this screenshot. There's more spike than land. Like Mega Man just had a heart attack. Speaking of which, invincibility frames don't even work on spikes. So if you touch them, you're dead no matter what, like in Mega Man 1. Which actually doesn't bother me. I like how you can't damage boost through any of it. My problem is that the iframes themselves are criminally brief. I feel like I'm getting pickpocketed every time I take damage. The whole point of invulnerability is to give you recovery time after taking a hit so you can readjust. And while this does prevent you from brute forcing, if you're being ganged up on by multiple enemies,
Hey, let's take his wallet.
You're going to get juggled, which is one of my biggest pet peeves in games. It sucks. What's odd about this though is that in spite of how hardcore the game appears, the health refills are surprisingly generous. For a game that's so obsessed with ending you in a single hit, it certainly has no problem with fully restoring your HP. It's like if someone burns your house down and then buys you dinner. Thanks, I'm homeless. Nearly every checkpoint does this by default, and there are tons of hidden health drops in walls and crates. This sounds okay on paper, especially given how low your starting HP is, but this sadly functions more like a band-aid solution to a deeper problem, and it doesn't even address the problem in question. Think about it, if players are dying to spikes too much, no amount of health refills are gonna change that. If they had just cut back on the instant death and maybe even given us a bigger starting health bar, we would have had more patience and leniency for the enemies, so they wouldn't have had to heal us as much. Because the problem with fully healing the player this often is that it no longer feels as special as if it was used sparingly. You start to expect it after a few screens instead of being pleasantly surprised when you get it. It's less, oh cool, some health, thanks, and more like,
where's my drink?
I have nothing against the health drops in this game. I think they're necessary to an extent, but the full restores, I think, send the wrong message. When you know that the next checkpoint is gonna give you full health and you'll never have to redo anything that came before it, tension is lifted. You don't feel like you have to play super well, just well enough to make it through. So you don't take it quite as seriously, but you're still dying a bunch and falling in pits, so it comes across like mixed signals. Oddly enough, Chapter 5 understands this, as it's the only one in the game where most of the checkpoints don't give you any health by default. And lo and behold, it's also one of my favorites. There are other factors that play into that, of course, but part of it is because I'm not getting healed all the time. I value the health drops when I find them. If I take too much damage early on, I'm not gonna survive later, so I gotta step up my game. Now, in all fairness, it generally speaking puts up a really good fight and spaces out the healing. Newcomers are looking at me like, what are you, crazy? This game's impossible. But there's definitely an internal struggle going on to find that perfect blend of risk and reward, patience and pacing. Get good, and good God. Megaskull has taken some measures to balance it out, repositioning and straight up removing enemies in patch updates, with more to come, I'm sure. And that shows that he's open to both criticism and a willingness to change the game post-release if it means a better product, and that is fantastic. We still have yet to see a major update or hotfix, but this is a great start. And thankfully, these are ultimately nitpicks on my end. I can safely report that the core experience remains solid all the way through, regardless of any snags, and only gets better from here. In fact, one could argue that the further in you you get, the more that Cyber Shadow plays like an entirely different game. As I said earlier, you gain abilities over time with enemies and level design evolving to accommodate your new skills. Geothermal Towers is a mostly vanilla stage with standard moving platforms and a focus on learning how to fight 2 or 3 enemies at once. You mind backing off? I'm doing like a show? Thanks. So at the end of it, when you unlock the Shuriken, the disposal facility starts incorporating these switches and wall lasers you can hit from a distance. After that, you get the Rising Fire, which works wonders on the more lethal airborne enemies of Mega City, as well as its 2 bosses. I mean, it just shreds the tank. I can't even feel good about this. Completing that gives you the Airstrike, a downwards attack that, in addition to damaging enemies underneath you, also adds some extra height and distance to your current jump, which can often mean the difference between falling to your doom or landing to safety, and if you hit anything with it, it resets, allowing you to reactivate and chain however many you can together. Before the next chapter can even start, you also get the Wall Slide from the Spirit Monkey. Hey, thanks, man.
Don't talk to me.
A conventional but no less game-altering tool. So when you make it to the reactor, you're bouncing off enemy chains, air-striking things under you, jumping up and sliding down walls. Vertical sections in general are more common now. This is where you start to see the gameplay shed its skin and really take off. Halfway through, you get the level 2 Katana, which I'm not really a fan of since it's a passive. It just doubles your damage and buffs your range a bit instead of changing how you play. I definitely prefer getting weapons that alter my playstyle versus a statistical improvement. But right after that, you get the parry, another fairly common mechanic in this day and age, but a welcome addition all the same that raises the skill ceiling by a lot. You can block nearly all physical attacks and then slash them back at the enemy. Even things that don't look like they could be parried, like fire. Not really sure how that works. This is a really fun way to turn defense into offense, and it makes you feel pretty unstoppable when you pull it off in quick succession. The research lab is chock full of these projectile-flinging walls that give you plenty of practice, and the bosses practically require it. They also have these great sections where you're being chased by a wall of instant death. Now this is how you do spikes in a fun way. They're right behind me, so I feel the urgency, but they're not going to catch up unless I make a lot of mistakes. It's in the back of my mind versus... yeah, you get the picture. But the best and by far most game-changing upgrade would be the sprint. By holding down R1 or double tapping a direction, if you want to know what true insanity feels like, you will be put into a sprint. In addition to increased running speed, this momentum carries over into your jump, letting you clear longer distances. That's all well and good, pretty standard. Attacking during a sprint, however, will initiate a dash, a quick boost forward with an awesome after image that damages anything caught in its path. You're also invulnerable during that brief window, allowing you to bypass certain obstacles. Yeah, that could happen. And you can activate this at any time, including mid-air. It costs 1 SP per dash, but destroying anything with it replenishes 1 back, and like the airstrike, it also resets upon contact, letting you chain as many of them together as the environment permits. This changes everything. The pacing of levels, how they're structured, how they play, how you view enemies and lanterns. Wider gaps in terrain can now be incorporated. Hazards like security lasers that you can pass through undetected. Shortcuts that only a daring dash can reach. Suddenly, you're not afraid of running into danger anymore because you want to see how far you can take it. How many consecutive dashes can you pull off without error? Both the Robot Factory and the Outskirts have tons of these preliminary dash sequences where it tests you on your accuracy over dangerous but still relatively short distances. Because once you've had enough practice, you then get all of your abilities upgraded by the Dragon, letting you charge your attacks for a Power Slash, a Flaming Shuriken that deals damage over time, a twice as potent Fire Strike, a Homing Parry, and a Double Jump. The one limitation of the dash was that, best case scenario, you went in a straight line. You could never ascend. If a target was too high up, it's too freaking bad, you just had to come down, which is why the sections were never very long. Not anymore. You now have a mid-air correction tool that can adjust your elevation. And like your other skills, this too resets every time you dash or airstrike something. Meaning levels can now incorporate these elongated segments of carefully placed enemies at varying altitudes that enable you to swiftly navigate an otherwise hazardous obstacle course without breaking the flow. It's very Sonic the Hedgehog in that regard. It caters heavily to a speed-focused venture, but never becomes all about it. Dashing is a tool that requires precision and care. Knowing the lay of the land in advance is going to help tremendously with your success. Charging in without a plan will all but guarantee failure. In fact, that's what's going to happen to you. With a new and exciting maneuver like this, it's easy to lose control. There's absolutely a learning curve attached. How did that happen? This is where the difficulty takes a launch pad into a new kind of hard. I won't say it's a spike, but it can and probably will catch you off guard if you don't adjust to the new set of rules that dashing brings. A common misconception is that once you get this dash, you just have to use it all the time. It's not the case. You're gonna want to because who wouldn't? But the game isn't designed for you to be able to do this without some kind of punishment. Instant death is more prevalent than ever. Enemies deal 2-3 times the damage. Room layouts are the longest and most intricate they've been. You will die. And possibly scream. I can't promise that you won't start throwing things, punching walls, breaking lamps. Your own father comes in, son, what's wrong? You'll say, I can't do it, Dad. I can't beat Cyber Shadow. And he's like, where did I go wrong as a parent? I can totally understand the criticism that the game doesn't necessarily accommodate this newfound speed right off the bat. You're given this new ability, you want to use it, but the levels are designed to be punishing. So you'll often attempt the dash, not knowing what's ahead, and likely fling yourself towards some spikes and not have the reaction time to save yourself or deal with any nearby enemies. That is a frustration that happens to basically everyone who plays this game. I can't entirely say it's the player's fault, and I can't entirely say it's the game's fault. And unlike Mega Man X, where you can let go of the D-pad in midair and keep your momentum if you press it again, letting go here will cancel it entirely. So if you want to keep dashing, you can't stop moving forward. It's a necessary limit, I suppose, otherwise you could dash anywhere at any time, which could be potentially game-breaking, but it can feel jarring when it happens. Most of the abilities do have at least one quirk about them that not everyone is equally forgiving towards. It's time to address that complaint, specifically in the button combinations and consistency. For instance, shuriken are thrown by pressing up and attack, and the rising fire with down and attack. Yeah, that's right, you press down to do an up attack. AVGN would be furious. Personally, this doesn't bother me, as I've played many games that adopt this control scheme, but there were a couple times where I meant to slash, and I threw a shuriken instead because my thumb was pressing diagonal up. It wasn't nearly big enough of a deal for me to care, but why we can't remap these abilities to whatever inputs we desire is a discussion worth having. I do think we should always have that option, especially when 2 of the face buttons go completely unused. The wall slide also has some collision weirdness. Since you don't stick to walls, you slide down them. If you let go of the D-pad, you'll let go of the wall. So if you want to jump to the opposite side of the wall you're on, like a traditional wall jump, you have to press the opposite side of the D-pad, letting go of the one you're on. But if you press it too quickly before jumping, you'll let go of the wall and won't jump in time. Also, you technically can't jump off of walls until your hand touches it. Again, this is a weird sprite precision issue. So if you jump into these one-tile squares, you actually won't even be able to cling to the wall, unless you jump at it from much higher. I swear, if I have to say jump or wall one more time, I think my head might pop off my body. There isn't a whole lot you can do to mitigate this either, aside from jumping first and then moving, or just memorizing the timing and getting used to it. Again, not the end of the world, but annoying when it happens. Parrying seems to be really tricky for some people too, but honestly, coming out of Fight and Rage, I thought the timing was generous if anything. I mean, it's precise, yeah, but that's how a parry is. Otherwise, you could negate all damage with ease. I can see it being a little awkward in midair because you have to tap the D-pad in the direction of the attack, stopping any forward momentum you have, which is unideal over pits. And if you're too early, you'll actually move closer to the attack, likely accelerating the damage you take, which can feel overly punishing, or like an oversight. But during slower sections, it was working just fine. I actually thought the D-pad setup was fairly intuitive, at least from a directional standpoint. Although this does mean that it activates on accident a lot. A happy accident for sure, but certainly disruptive to an extent, and again, letting us map our own inputs would instantly remedy these complaints, even if I don't share in the vitriol. Also, another strange quirk is that some abilities have secondary traits if you have SP. For example, the airstrike is normally a basic down stab, but if you have SP, it'll consume one to gain lightning properties, giving double damage and this cool stomp if you press down and attack. However, there's no way to control when SP is used. Let's say you're running low and want to conserve some ammo, but you have to use the airstrike to get by. You can't turn off that secondary attack. You have to use your spirit, even if you don't want or need those effects at that time. Then, when you need something like the flames or a throwing star, your supply has been unnecessarily drained, resulting in what feels like a waste that wasn't even in your control. This is definitely in the minority, and spirit drops are common enough, but it's a weird limitation that could probably be fixed by having a toggle feature. Press a button to turn SP usage off, then toggle it back on afterwards. Definitely not high on the list of priorities. I wouldn't be upset if this never got addressed, but it would be nice to see a fix in the foreseeable future. Regardless, while a bit steeper than I'd like, I believe this is a learning curve worth adopting. When you understand how everything works and can successfully weave through that long and winding stretch of robots and spikes without stopping or getting hit, that is Cyber Shadow. When people look back on this title or see other similar games get made, it's this idea that will take center stage. It's flashy, fluid, not easy to pull off, and beyond thrilling for a game of this caliber. And in that sense, Arne succeeded in creating a truly unique style that you can't fully compare to anything else. That excitement that you feel when tearing through a section using raw instinct that you know you could have taken slower is one of a kind, and is what everyone is going to remember most about it. However, and this is a pretty big however, this creates a massive divide in gameplay. For the first half, you are a slow and strategic Shatterhand Batman throwback. In the second half, these styles are such polar opposites that it feels like I'm playing 2 half games instead of 1 completed entry. Now, The Messenger did this same kind of bait and switch where the first 3 hours were linear, you were leveling up, and then it pulled the rug from under your feet and said, by the way, we're a Metroidvania now, completely turning you on your head. We were all like, sweet, where do I go? But because it never went this fast, it could maintain the same pace throughout. You also had the Cloud Step from the beginning and like an additional 12 hours of playtime after that surprise. Also, the hat, but in Cyber Shadow, you get the dash halfway through an already significantly shorter campaign. 5 to 10 hours on average, and then 1 to 3 when you know what you're doing. By the time you get the double jump, there are only 3 chapters left. There's no new game plus, no higher difficulties, no boss rush or time attack, no secret ending or costumes, no giant head mode. Players have found code that says new game plus and true ninja, not to mention the game labels your save file as normal mode, which there would be no need to specify if it was the only difficulty you could choose, so clearly they have some plans down the pipeline. But as it is right now, you only get to experience Shadow at his best for 30% of the adventure. That's kind of a big deal because by the time the game ends, it really feels like it's just getting started. Not only because you've hardly had any time fully powered up, but because that slower first half you were playing just kind of stops. It doesn't get a proper send-off. Once you have the dash, your whole mindset changes. It's like you're starting anew. 1 to 3 hours is plenty long for a game that sticks to one style, but because we have this contrast in speed, it feels like it ends premature, as if what you're doing in those final chapters should be happening much longer after the fact. And so you're left with these 2 bookends to a game that doesn't feel quite long enough. Better to be asking for more than wishing it was over, that's for sure, but still. This is something that even diehard fans that loved every moment can agree on. We just needed more. At least more focus. I would have even been fine if the whole game was without the dash. Yeah, I haven't lost my mind. Sure, you would lose that spectacle, but it would be consistent. I actually played through the entire game without using the dash just to see if it was possible, and not only did I find out that it was, but by playing the whole game at that one constant speed, it actually felt more finished by the end. I didn't feel like I didn't have enough time with my character and his abilities because the gameplay never veered so far off its own path. Even though I was still being upgraded, my playstyle never changed, it simply evolved in controlled increments. And due to this self-imposed handicap, it presented some of the hardest challenges the game had to offer. It gave me that conventional platforming difficulty that you don't normally see in the second half, since the one unfortunate drawback to dashing is that you lose a lot of enemy intensity and strategy, since you can blow right past 70% of them.
Ah yes, Shadow. It is time for us to engage in combat.
It's fun and comes with its own kind of challenge, as I've already explained, but it's a give and take. Going slow allowed me to appreciate the details I would have probably never noticed otherwise. Like how these wall turrets will start flying around and chase you if you let them fire off 3 rounds. Nearly fell out of my chair when I saw that. Look at them go! I'm not saying that this is the go-to Cyber Shadow experience, but without that harsh contrast in style, it did provide a somewhat more fulfilling one in its own way. And as of right now, if you combine this no sprinting rule with the Born Ready achievement where you can't upgrade your HP and SP, you have the closest thing to an official hard mode, so we're not completely devoid of post-game content. That being said, New Game Plus is still intrinsic for any future DLC. In my opinion, it should be priority number 1 if new content is ever discussed. Well, next to Warrior of Love, of course. What if we got to play as that cool Golden Shadow at the end with all of our abilities from the get-go? Or an expert mode where you take more damage, harder enemies appear earlier, no free healing at checkpoints. Heck, double down on the spikes, I can take it. You know, maybe I'll think about it. Or maybe a classic mode where we're stripped away of our skills as young Shadow in his purple attire. Better yet, how about a prequel story with Shadow and the Master side by side in Shadow of the Ninja inspired co-op? I'm getting sweaty just thinking about it. There are so many possibilities here for even greater things that it's hard not to feel a smidge underwhelmed by some of the choices made in the final product. I like this game a lot. I feel the need to stress that. I wouldn't have played it 9 times over and spent 2 months writing a video that's gonna make a collective $4 if I didn't. But every time I look at it, I see Chronicles of untapped potential. There are many concepts here, big and small, that get left unrealized. Enemy types, for example, the variety here is phenomenal. Every chapter has its own unique pool of robots, with very few getting recycled at a later point. The reactor in particular, I think, has the most thought-provoking interactions and combos in the whole game. You're given more than enough time to get acquainted with how these jellyfish and Power Ranger heads operate. But then other chapters are just like, yeah, this enemy's pretty cool, but what if you fought him once? Like these green E.T. Yoda necks coming out of the ground. I love these. They move up and down to match your elevation and then fire. They even turn around if you pass them. It's freaking rad. This is an intelligent behavior for a level 1 enemy. I can't wait to see what else they do. That's the last one, isn't it? Yep. You only ever see 5 of these in the entire game, and it's all within the first 5 minutes. Oh, but the rust flies, yeah, I'll take 7,000. Same thing with these hawks that drop bombs. The normal ones get plenty of screen time, but the bombs only show up like twice, and you can just run past them. Oh. Blue Robot Dude, same deal. He chucks grenades so high they'll never hit you in time. Meanwhile, he's somersaulting around like he's the ninja. I like to imagine he's playing his own theme music in his head while he does that. These turrets with 2 very distinct and potentially lethal attack patterns get used, I think, twice. And I already mentioned the flying wall turret discovery of 2021. You are never going to see that happen in a standard playthrough. But it's there. And on one hand, I commend the attention to detail and superb enemy variety. I love to see it. But you never get a chance to interact with these qualities unless you stop completely to smell the roses, which isn't exactly intuitive. And even then, the encounters themselves are so few, it ultimately comes off like a tease. This isn't a detriment by any means. I know plenty of great games that have one-and-done enemies, and most of them are good here, but I can't help but feel slightly disappointed when the behaviors are this elaborate. Complementing this, I think the default movement could have also had more to it. I know I discounted it in the beginning, but not being able to duck does have a stronger impact on gameplay than at first glance. By having a static character like this, it eliminates 2 basic interactions. Enemies that shoot at your upper half requiring a simple crouch to evade, and the ground-based enemies that can only be slashed while crouching. Take those away and you no longer need that extra mental step of deciding when ducking is a good idea. Thus, every enemy now dies to a slightly more similar hack-and-slash method, which is inherently more monotonous. How many times? Pole grabbing is another great way to interact with your environment in a ninja-like way that sadly was never incorporated. And while not mandatory for success, these exclusions do contribute to the early game feeling somewhat barren and limited, maybe even sluggish at points. This sucks. But then we have those weird inconsistencies of Cyber Shadow. These are the ideas that just vanish at random points and might come back, nobody really knows. Like, why is chapter 4 18 minutes when everything else is 7 to 12? This has bewildered me to no end. Was he just that proud of what he had made and couldn't trim it down? I can sympathize with that, I get it. But that doesn't change the fact that the longest chapter in the game, aside from 8, isn't even halfway into the story. Meanwhile, Mecha City Docks, the penultimate stage, is only 5 minutes with a 2-minute auto-scroller factored in. What? I think we can all agree that typically stages get longer the deeper into a campaign you get, even if marginally. That seems to be the most logical approach to game progression. That, or they at least stay the same. But here, the second half as a whole feels considerably shorter than the first, and by most accounts, that is backwards to how you do a steady game curve. I would have gladly traded a few minutes off of the Rustfly Frat Factory if it meant longer endgame stages, I'll tell you that. There's still a ton of fun and plenty difficult, but this plays into those overarching themes of not going all the way and feeling too short that I've already mentioned. Plus, it's not just the levels themselves that are short. They're missing boss fights. For chapters 1 through 5, it follows a standard formula, 1 mid-boss and 1 main. Cut, print, that's how it's done. Yes. But then chapter 6 comes along and decides to break tradition. You fight the tunnel cleaner at what appears to be a midpoint, and then it goes straight to the outskirts, where the trend not only continues, but it actually gets worse by not having a boss at all. Chapter 8 sort of has a mid-fight, but then there's no main again. Chapter 9, same thing, no bosses, just a rematch with the tank, and then you ride a boat for 2 minutes. Aw, sweet. The finale brings us back home, thankfully, but by then, it's honestly too late. The damage has already been done. We're short at least 5 boss fights, and I'm convinced that they would have helped even out the second half had they been included. Maybe they thought the levels were long enough for a casual player, accounting for all the deaths, and adding bosses would feel too bloated, but to me, it feels like there's content missing, especially in Return to Mecha City. Apparitor, your rival, who you've already fought once, shows up at the end as if you're gonna duke it out. Sup? But instead of actually fighting him, it's just a cutscene of getting your armor crushed and then he runs away like,
"Sorry, Link."
How cool would it have been if we got to fight him in the armor, he breaks it, then finish him off as normal Shadow with a hint of vengeance for our fallen comrade. Or maybe we overpower him while wearing the suit, but once it's broken, he regains the advantage, proving to us how much weaker we still are as a fighter. I am liquidating my assets just thinking about that. He even has a health bar that fills up, and there's a checkpoint right beforehand. Maybe this was planned at some point to be a boss, but got scrapped for time. You still have a rematch with him at the final boss, but this would have been a great opportunity to show how much stronger Apparitor had gotten, and give you both a gameplay and story goal to work towards in the finale. He even mentions how he's received upgrades and taunts you about not needing them to take you out, so this would have only enriched your motivation and connection to Shadow, while also increasing the tension between their rivalry, which doesn't get enough screen time as is. If it's at all possible, I would add these fights in at some point. Considering how good the ones in-game already are, I would never say no to more. Now, if you want to talk about a concept dropping off the face of the earth, look no further than the backtracking. Yeah, that's right, you can technically revisit old chapters via the teleporters to pick up any upgrades you may have missed. Sweet. But aside from the 4 items that you need other abilities for, everything else can be found on your first run, and these things are not hard to spot. Being able to find almost every item without backtracking may not sound like a problem. In fact, you'll likely view that as a positive, but it begs the question, what's the point of mandatory backtracking and the discovery of new locations if it's going to be used this sparingly? I only say this because exploration is clearly not a focus in this linear action adventure, and yet it leads you on at many points as if it's going in that direction. As early as Chapter 1, you encounter this orange gate that can't be broken. And in the menu, you can see that chapter percentages are incomplete even after you beat them. So all throughout the game, you're thinking, I'm gonna come back to these later and there's gonna be a lot more content, right? No. You will revisit these areas, and there will be extra content for about 15 minutes. Your first try, it might take an hour, most of it being spent dying in this elevator.
Oh, they're back?
But it's short-lived all the same. You're expecting it to be this super involved secondary quest where you go back to every chapter all decked out, since that's what other games have conditioned us to anticipate. But only maybe 10% of that expectation is actually met. This is not the upside-down castle from Symphony of the Night. It's a lot more like going back for all the heart tanks in a Mega Man X game. You're not seeing anything terribly new, it's just a routine cleanup before the finale. We do get a couple of cool sections, some being quite the challenge. I especially enjoyed getting to explore the upper heights of Mecha City, but that's all we get. It's kept to such a minimum that it makes me wonder if any of it was scrapped upon release, and if so, how much? The world of Cyber Shadow is more than capable of having double the content if they wanted it to. You can see plenty of spots where the chapters could have branched off into completely new territories. Return to Mecha City takes you through new parts of chapters 3, 4, and 6, and the way that you get to see them all interconnect really makes the world feel so much more dense, as if it's going to keep expanding. There's even an attempt at a hub world at one point. You've got an elevator, the docks, the train crash at the tunnel where we meet the lonely robot, aka the saddest NPC ever created. Had it kept going in that direction, I think a very successful open world could have been achieved. But I understand that 1, that's a lot of additional work, and 2, that wasn't the kind of game he wanted to make. He wanted it to be a traditional linear side-scroller, and I respect that. It is my favorite genre after all. But if you're going to add an element like backtracking into your game, you kind of have to go all the way with it, or else it comes across like an afterthought. It also doesn't help that some of the secrets you find are kind of lazy. Most of them are pretty fun, where you have to fight a mini-boss or do some intense platforming, as I said, but then you get those random few that are just waiting to be claimed. Like breaking a wall and there it is! Or tripping explosives to break a barrier, but it's not like there's a puzzle involved or even the threat of messing up. You just hit it with your sword. Grab it. The worst one of all is in Chapter 5. I can't even look at it without getting heart palpitations. Maybe he was just being nice, but it comes off like I didn't know where else to put this, and I didn't want to make a special room for it, so here you go. The whole second half of the game has less upgrades in general, too, bringing us back to that initial problem of the end game not having enough content. I almost feel like repurposing these Metroidvania assets into more general gameplay would have been a better call. More bosses, equal chapter lengths, better item grabs, more dojos. Jeez, yeah, let's talk about these for a minute. I know I've been kind of going on a tangent here, and I don't mean to sound overly negative, but if I had to label any one piece of content here as disappointing, you're looking at it. I'm sorry, old man, I don't like you. Dojos are short hub areas that take you into the ethos, an alternate plane. There are 4 in total, and it starts off promising with the monkey race and the second one where you fight the spirits of past ninja. Neither of them are especially difficult, they're more or less tutorials, but still interactive and a nice change of pace. But then the third one comes around, and there's this big plant corrupting the ethos. So you hit it, and you get the dash. Excuse me? That's it. No enemies, no boss, no race, nothing. This is weird to me, because so far, the dojos have presented themselves as mini hub areas, nice open spaces, NPCs to talk to, little mini-game challenges like this to give you an item. But then this one comes along and frankly throws it all away in favor of something that could be described as an interactive cutscene. And unfortunately, the 4th and final dojo at the Dragon Shrine is even more disappointing, because that's where you get all of your powers upgraded. So what could have been a really climactic showdown, where you prove your worth to the dragon, is instead a bunch of text that tells you about your new powers, and then you leave. Substantially less interesting of a route to take. And it's a shame because I think dojos could have really been a mainstay, either acting as tutorials or a way of acquiring bonus items. Say instead of getting an HP container handout, it's a reward for clearing a dojo. There would also be a lot more world building thanks to the NPCs. Maybe there could even be optional minigames to help earn bonus cash. Possibilities are kind of endless here. I could technically make the same criticism for the cyberspace areas, and yes, there is a lot more that could have been done there, but I'll cut it some slack for actually having content in all 4 terminals, even if the same mini-boss gets used twice. Now, one final subject that I want to spend some time on is how sub-weapons are handled. At certain checkpoints, you can pay for bonuses using the essence that you get from killing enemies and breaking boxes. In addition to full HP and SP, you can also get the corresponding sub-weapon that's available, and these benefits are all permanent once unlocked. However, the item will break if you take 3 hits, so they don't last forever. Quite the opposite, actually. You'll have to go back to the checkpoint you got it from or hold out for another shop if you want it back. It's an interesting take on the sub-weapon staple. They're all self-sufficient in that they have unlimited ammo, but their durability is fragile, and unlike getting them as a random item drop like in most games, these are far less common and almost always only available for purchase. What I really like about this system is that on top of needing to ration your wallet, make the right call between spending now or later, you have to play well if you want to hold on to it. And because the items themselves are so good, there's plenty of incentive to build up the cash and make them last. There's the Blade Extend, giving you more range, the most dynamic weapon ever, the Swag Blade, yes, that is its actual name, that uses your own body as a center point to build momentum and swing around. E-Field absorbs almost every projectile and can be launched as its own. Charge Blaster will fire a single long-range projectile if you keep attacking, but if you let it charge up, it'll do a much more powerful cluster shot. SP Dispenser is a utility that passively feeds you 1 SP every few seconds. Nin Gun is a turret that can be pointed in any of the 8 directions and will automatically home in on anything in sight. Orbiter is a shield of orbs that causes damage to all enemies on contact, but needs to be replenished. It also expands for a moment when you slash, giving you some extra reach. And finally, we have Salvager, what I can only describe as a flying Roomba that homes in on projectiles, converting them to SP. It can't block everything at once, but it's a pseudo-shield weapon that also restores ammo. It's really good. All of these sub-weapons are really good, actually. None of them reach the same complexity as the Swag Blade, and a couple of the guns are a little too similar, but they all have a use and don't feel undermined by any of the others. It's a great assortment to help you in those tough times. The only problem is that you have a very limited selection on what items you can use at what times. It's completely dependent on which checkpoint you're at. There's no RNG, it's always the same one every time, but the game likes to use a consistent item throughout each chapter, so you'll only have 1 or 2 options in a given area, which is good for getting used to how one works, but this means that you can go a very long time without seeing a certain weapon again. Take the Swag Blade, for instance. It's at every checkpoint in Chapter 3, and then you never see it again, aside from 1 hidden box off to the side in the finale. Charge Blaster, same thing, all over Chapter 4, and then nothing aside from 1 box. Orbiter and Salvager don't even show up until halfway through the game. To its credit, it does give you the best weapon for the upcoming challenge, but this also takes away from any experimentation you can do. And there's no inventory, so it's not like you can hold on to one and swap out later. This is where I propose that more secret rooms could have really come in handy. There's already a handful that exist, as we've discussed, but they only ever hold HP and SP containers. I think they could have thrown in sub-weapon rooms to help expand level design, enhance exploration, and vary up the weapon selection mid-chapter. They do have surprise weapons in certain boxes, but it's not a common occurrence by any stretch. Currency could have also played a much bigger role in this. The only way to get any is via enemies and boxes. Again and again and again, but they're always in plain sight and aren't hard to get, so you'll likely have the same amount of cash on every playthrough. Plus, everything respawns when you re-enter a room, so you can technically grind. It's not time efficient in the slightest, and the big crates don't respawn thankfully, but the fact that you can do it at all does seem exploitative. Assuming that was fixed, I think money rooms could have been scattered all over the place for more content and a bigger salary to afford more purchases. The Messenger has these, both Curse of the Moon titles do, Shovel Knight, the list goes on. Any game with a prominent currency is wise to incorporate some kind of treasure room. It would also make the boxes more fun to collect inherently because it's not terribly exciting to go whack an orange cube that's slightly off to the side. But finding a secret room on the other side of a wall, hey, that's interesting. To complement this, checkpoints could have had multiple tiers of purchase. After paying for one sub-weapon, a second better one could then be available for you to buy, which would justify the need for all those side rooms. Or instead of giving us full health at every checkpoint by default, maybe it starts as only a few points and then we pay to upgrade the amount. Bosses could even drop essence upon death, scaling with how well you played. Say the faster it dies and the less damage you take, the higher the bounty, creating a positive gameplay loop where the better you perform, the more options and rewards you'll have. You can see how a simple idea like money can evolve into so much more with proper innovation. What we have here is good, but it could have been taken a lot further. And that really is the name of the game here when you break it down. If I had to pinpoint Cyber Shadow's one fatal flaw, it would be untapped potential. Isolated, these all appear to be very minor nitpicks. But when you start putting it all together, the clashing styles, uneven chapter lengths, missing boss fights, cut story content, minimal backtracking, lack of any new game plus or bonus modes, no optional button configurations, underperforming dojos, simplistic currency, rigid sub-weapon accessibility, and a character who can't even duck, and it's hard for me not to imagine all the what-ifs without being somewhat disappointed by the reality, even though I had a blast. When that first trailer dropped, I saw nothing but heaps of potential, and while I enjoyed what I played and can call this a massive success in indie game design, a lot of that potential still has yet to be uncovered in my eyes. Thankfully, we live in an age where all hope doesn't have to be lost, updates and patches are common, if enough people voice their opinion, changes can be made. RNA is still a one-man show for the most part, so I'm not going to set unrealistic expectations, but in a world where Mega Man Rock and Roll exists, I'm optimistic. Now, one area that did not disappoint was the soundtrack. Enrique Martin, aka Pentadrangle, what a name, has composed both a catchy and moody chiptune OST, and it's pretty amazing. From the tranquil title theme, to the energetic geothermal towers, to the more pensive, melancholic robot factory, the music never fails on delivering the goods. Also, there are like 70 tracks. That kinda blew my mind when I saw that. My only problem with the music is that I can't throw money at it. Like seriously, put this on Bandcamp or something. With tunes this good, I have to support the official release. I know before I was criticizing for like 14 pages, holy! But I want to make it clear for the third time now that in spite of its somewhat polarizing shortcomings and my lengthy criticisms, I do really like this game. I'm probably going to play it again right after this. The pixel art is gorgeous, controls are tight, the music speaks for itself, I applaud the higher difficulty, and the dashing gameplay is truly one of a kind. I'm just saying that there's still room for improvement, and I hope that my criticizing may assist in paving the way towards an even better product. That being said, Arne should definitely be patting himself on the back for doing what even AAA companies often struggle with. It's not easy. $20 is a little steep for the content right now. If you want to wait for a small sale, you can, but once we get that New Game Plus, it's an easy recommend. Thank you guys so much for watching what is currently my longest scripted video ever. I'm gonna try and keep it that way for a bit too. And as always, don't forget to check out the next episode whenever I post it, which will probably be soon. Alright. See ya.